Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Suzanne Switzenberg. I work at the Lewis and Clark Library, and we are so excited to be able to partner with the Montana Historical Society and have Rachel Potter here to talk. This is part of the NEA Big Read, which is a program of the National Endowment for the Arts in partnership with Arts Midwest. And our book this year was Lab Girl by Hope Jaron. And she is a geobiologist and talks about trees, soil, and plants, as well as a memoir of her own life of growing up in a science home and then coming into a lab of her own. She's in Oslo currently with her very own really cool lab. And we asked her twice if she would come, and she said no. So, but we do have Rachel Potter, who's here to talk about Montana's Pioneer Botanists. We're so excited to have her. Just a little bit about Rachel. She is the co-editor of this book. She earned a BA in botany in the hallowed halls of the
Natural Science Building, the University of Montana.
I totally blanked out on that.
That's okay.
Sorry. And she worked and now plays in Glacier National Park, where the plants and landscape have captivated her for over 4 decades. She lives in Columbia Falls and is currently secretary of the Montana Native Plant Society. Please help me welcome Rachel Potter.
Can you hear me? Okay. Well, thank you to the library and to the Historical Society for having me. Let's see, Alt-Tab. I'm switching over. So what's the deal with all these people we've been, uh-oh. Oh, escape, okay, of course. Okay, and now, Alt-Tab, thank you. There we go. So what was the deal with all those people that you've been seeing pictures of? Well, this book that we published a couple of years ago, and by the way, is we're out of print. We sold out. We only printed 400 copies, but it's available in your libraries. I think it was a really unique story because it's essays, 29 different essays written by 19 different botanists. We've got 32 different photographers and illustrators, a whole bunch of different people collaborating, and everybody's been volunteering. I think it's been a unique project of people, and so my previous little show was kind of to celebrate all of those people, not only the subjects of some of the essays, but also the people involved in the book. I'd like to dedicate today's presentation to, I hope that doesn't continue to do that. I just went back. To Jerry DeSanto, who was a historian. He actually wrote quite a number of articles for Montana, the Magazine of Western History, and by bulk, I think, is the author of more of the book. Jerry was a real great friend of mine, a big-time mentor, a historian by schooling. He was a ranger and a self-taught botanist that brought a bunch of us along also. So because we're at the Historical Society, I'd like to dedicate today's presentation to Jerry. Okay, what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the history of the book, how it got started, how we pulled the different parts together, and then just vignettes from a few of the different chapters, and that'll be it. So, kind of started with the very beginning of the Montana Native Plant Society. Kathy Ahlenslager is a good friend of mine, and she got her bachelor's degree in botany her master's degree in botany from the University of Montana, and then she was the curator of the herbarium there. She and Peter Lesica were in Missoula, and if you don't know about Peter, he was then, probably has been ever since, the kind of the preeminent Montana botanist, if we were to have one. He's written a whole number of books, numerous professional papers, tons of articles. Kathy came from California, and she'd been involved in the California Native Plant Society, and she and Peter got together and said, we need a Native Plant Society. So they did it. Here we are. We're still going over 30 years later. And one of the very first meetings, planning meetings, was in Bonner Park in Missoula. And Caroline Clemens, who had a native plant nursery up on Flathead Lake, brought her father, Art Krukberg, and he was a professor of botany at the University of Washington and had started the Washington Native Plant Society. And so Caroline brought Art, and it was great because it was like a real grand sage, you know, giving us his blessing. And Art met Peter, and he had long had a vision of a book that was going to be called Plant Hunters of the Pacific Northwest. And he and Dr. Rhoda Love from Layton Community College envisioned this as something where different botanists would write. It would be a book of essays written by a bunch of different botanists about botanists. I don't know, maybe he just didn't want to write the whole thing, you know, get somebody else to do the writing. Sounds like a good plan to me. But they asked Peter to get people to write essays in Montana, and Peter did that, and a whole bunch of people wrote essays a lot of other places. Well, Art and Rhoda just got really old, and those essays just sat there, which was pretty sad. And then a couple years before 2010, well, Glacier National Park was celebrating its centennial in 2010, and I said to Peter, you know, we should do something. It was a great celebration. Lots of different parts and groups did their own thing. And we should do some research into botanists in the park for the centennial. And we did that, and included going and digging up some of these things that had been written, because some of those botanists had been in Glacier. And I actually presented kind of a short program at the history conference here in 2010. But then Peter came to me and said, you know, we really have got to publish these essays. I'm sure he felt really guilty. Jerry DeSanto, for instance, I mean, this was in the early 90s, okay? So he had, when he'd written these essays, he had traveled all over the country, gone to the National Archives. Now, lots of herbariums are digitized, and so it's kind of amazing. You can just, go bloop, 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 and here is a specimen that Charles Geyer collected along the Bitterroot River in 1843, and you can see his notes. Well, there wasn't anything like that, so a lot of work was put into those early essays. So Peter said, Rachel, would you want to help me with this? And he knew, because of my relationship with Jerry, who'd been sick for many years, that I wouldn't say no. So we started in on it. I want to thank the Montana Native Plant Society board and members, and also we just had some people in the public that supported us financially. The Plant Society we took some risks. They wanted the book to be relatively cheap, so we sold it just pretty much right above cost. Because we did end up selling out, we didn't lose money, but we didn't know that. So it's called Plant Hunters, and people were hunting for plants, but I was hunting for essays, and it was quite the saga pulling all these together. Annie Gard, who some of you may know, had written an essay, I think one of my favorite essays, about a real strange fellow, Marcus Jones. But, this was 20 years ago, and she hadn't finished it, and so she had these computer files, and she couldn't tell what was notes and what was her writing, and so she was terrified. This was around a time plagiarism was kind of front and center in Montana politics a few years ago, if you remember. We had a Senate candidate and she was like, oh my God, so she basically had to write the whole bloody thing over, and you can imagine Annie going on like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm gonna do, because she couldn't figure out, she didn't want to plagiarize anything. I received a digital file of an essay about Morton J. Elrod that nobody could decide who wrote it. Dr. Jim Habeck, the University of Montana, had done a lot of research that he sent to Art Krukberg, and maybe at first Jim said, well, no, I didn't write that, and then he said, he did an awful good job with the material I sent him, and then said, well, maybe I did. So, and then I added a bunch of stuff. We ended up putting all three of our names on it. So that was pretty odd. When I was digging around in Jerry's papers at the University of Montana for information on botanists for the centennial, Glacier Centennial, I saw that he'd done a whole bunch of work on R.S. Williams. Well, his partner, Karen, knew that he'd finished an essay and sent it to Rhoda Love. She insisted, and I kept, but there was nothing in his papers. There were no copies. And I kept asking Rhoda, well, could you look for that again? No, I never got anything. No, and Karen said, I know. And I was just about to hire a friend's daughter who was at the University of Oregon to try to, sweet talk Rhoda. Meanwhile, Rhoda's getting pretty old, sweet talk her and get to know her and say, could I dig through your closets? And after a year, I get a call from Rhoda. You'll never guess what I found. And there it was. So one of my jobs for the book was going to be finding portraits of these people. And pretty early on, I realized there weren't, photographs or paintings or anything of a lot of these, a number of them. So what are you going to do instead? I said, well, maybe we can have their favorite flower or something instead of the portrait. And then we started thinking about it a little more. And, we imagined a book that would be cheap to print, put some nice buff-colored paper and essays and pictures of what I quickly realized were going to be mostly dead white guys. Somehow it just didn't turn me on. And we realized that we could also, we're talking about wildflowers. And we're talking about these people working in amazing landscapes. And so it became a whole different book. And when we realized we can incorporate these things. I also knew that I love his botanical illustrations. And I wanted to include some. I really didn't know how to do that. This book was done on pretty much zero budget. I mean, you wouldn't believe what I went through to get archivists to waive fees. And anyway, and I told Peter, well, maybe we can find some public domain things. He says, well, nobody was drawing or painting these plants long enough ago for them to be in the public domain. And then I came across Mary Vox Walcott's work. She was from a wealthy Philadelphia Quaker family. She was in the Canadian Rockies. They first went through there in 1887, excuse me. And she continued to come back for 50 years. And just went into she's an amazing person. Oh, there's a poster I didn't bring, but you can see it online. You can Google her, and there's lots of fascinating information. So her family spent months on end in the backcountry in the Canadian Rockies. Well, if you're Quaker and you're wealthy, you can't just go and have fun, And even her artwork was a little, so, she had to do it very scientifically, and she wrote up about, the individual plants that she was either painting or photographing. She was the first woman that we know of to scale a 10,000-foot peak in the Canadian Rockies, her first white woman. She was one of the founding members of the Alpine Club of Canada. And so her family came through when the Canadian Railroad first went through the Rockies in 1887, and then they came back in 1893, and she and her brothers was, oh my gosh, the glaciers are shrinking. So what do? They start measuring and photographing the glaciers. I mean, I don't know, who does that mean? Who here has read Lab Girl? Okay, a number of them. So, I mean, this is right up. I mean, that's what she would do. So Hope Jaron, she's in Ireland trying to, help her her lab partner, and she kneels down in the moss, and it's as wet and lush up on top of the hill, and it's down, and by gosh, she's going to figure it out. Well, I think that, I know that she would have really appreciated Mary Fox Walcott, and vice versa. So Mary, meanwhile, continues to, she's painting these wonderful wildflower drawings. At the age of 54, she marries Charles Doolittle Walcott, who's the secretary, which is like the director of the Smithsonian Institution, and he has discovered the Burgess Shale up in Yoho National Park. Her father was absolutely livid as far as he was concerned. She was put on earth to take care of him, but she married him and moved to Washington, and the Smithsonian in 1925 published her 5-volume Wildflowers of North America, and it's really a unique undertaking. She raised something like $250,000 in 1925. She had printers do a bunch of research. This was really the infancy of color printing, because you think of it, we had engravings, and then we had lithographs, and so trying to get the colors to come up right. So that was a lot of money. And there's copies of these, one of the archives at the University of Montana. So the pictures we used, we did really high quality scans of those really pristine plates. There's one in the archives at the herbarium at Montana State University. And because it was published by the Smithsonian, it's always been public domain. So you can use those. So that was a real find for me. Just beautiful work. You can go online. I did a poster just with some more background about her. Another member wrote an essay. There's actually a new book, relatively new book out. She was called The Audubon of Botany. Oh, wait a minute. Oh, that's interesting. I'm skipping. I really didn't know how, probably for 3 years before I actually started laying out the book. I didn't know how the botanical illustrations were going to work with color photos and portraits, and I lay in bed at night for, I don't know, tons of time trying to envision it, and I couldn't until after. I couldn't find anybody to teach me InDesign. There weren't any classes. I probably watched about 50 YouTube tutorial videos on how to do it, but these young people are up there going blah, 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 blah. So I would listen to one sentence or half a sentence, and I'd go pause, and then I'd think, okay, what are they doing? But I think it worked out. I'm trying to think, what was I going to say there? So the other source of the illustrations, Wayne Phillips, one of our longtime founding members, wrote a book on the plants of Lewis and Clark. And when he was researching this, there was a Lewis and Clark scholar talking in Great Falls, I think. And Wayne went up to him and said, gosh, wouldn't it be great to get a copy or a reprint of Persh's Flora of or Description of Plants of North America? So when Meriwether Lewis got his through all sorts of different means, his plant collections back to Pennsylvania, and of course he died not that many years later, and Frederick Persh essentially took over curating them and describing them and writing them up, and then Persh ended up in England, and so he said to this guy, well, gosh, it would be great, and the speaker said, well, actually, there's somewhere in Germany that is reprinting this, so you can do it. Call Lubrecht and Kramer. So Wayne calls Lubrecht and Kramer. Well, they're moving. So Mrs. Lubrecht answers and says, no, we can't talk to you. And then Wayne starts talking, and she says, no, Harry, you have to talk to this guy. And so Harry Lubrecht gets on the phone with Wayne, and and Harry says, well, actually, my family has a bit of a connection to Montana. Have you ever heard of the Lubrecht Experimental Forest? Well, Wayne is a graduate of the School of Forestry. He's been to Lubrecht Forest, and they go, and then of course he talks, Wayne has been doing living history, things, making himself up into Lewis and Clark, and they really hit it off. And so these reprints are going to be about $40, and Lubrecht says to Wayne, well, I actually have a first edition of that. Would you like that? And Wayne says, yeah, right, but I'm sure I can't afford it. I'll sell it to you for the same amount, $59, just sell it to you for $59. And he did, and it's probably worth $10,000. And Wayne talked to somebody else, and they just said, Harry knew you needed that book. So this first edition of Persia's is in a safe deposit box in Great Falls, but Wayne pulled it out again, and we did new scans that we included in our book, and now these are engravings. So figure somebody drew a painting, and then an engraver took a block and engraved it, and then so the copy that Wayne has was then hand-colored. You go back in and hand-color. So for all these different things. Oh, there we go. I moved it around. I didn't really know how the historical or the botanical illustrations were going to work out, but they worked out fine. Gertrude Norton, for the longest time, this was the only picture I could find of her in any archives anywhere. It was scrawled on the back by Elrod, Mrs. Norton, Mount McDougal. Well, I looked at that right away and knew it was up in the Jewel Basin hiking area. That's Picnic Lakes behind. And eventually, with help from archives, found this picture on the shores of Flathead Lake. That's Gertrude in the middle. I guess, there we go. Back. Gertrude in the middle. Morton J. Elrod. This is Morton's wife. I love the whole picture. We really couldn't put it in the book with that fuzziness. I like the idea. There's lots of pictures of Mrs. Elrod. I'm sure we could have gotten one and photoshopped it in there. It wasn't fuzzy, but that's you don't do that. Archivists, you don't do that to historical photos. So we just cropped it. And then we started finding, so it was so fun. I really hadn't done any history, coming up with things like this. This is a field trip probably in the northern part of the Mission Mountains, things like that we were able to include in the book. Other things, I had a copy of this Elrod's Guide, 1925, second edition, for a long time with this drawing on the front. Didn't really think much of it till I'm going through the 75 feet of Morton J. Elrod collections at U of M and come up with that photo that was taken in 1909 up on Sperry Glacier. And so that was quite all this stuff was fun. And then able to use other photos that are in the public domain, like Curtis's. That one's not. So who are all these people? Well, first of all, they're people like Hope that love plants. But they're from all different kinds of walks of life. Nathaniel Wyeth had made a fortune. He came up and I don't know, some way of easily cutting ice in the winter. And he'd made all this money. He was going to go west and maybe make a bunch more money mining or something. He didn't know, but gosh, he started collecting plants, and he just loved it. And things like mule's ears are named after him. He really got into. Frank Tweedy was a surveyor for the USGS, and again, plants started to really intrigue him. Hans Gillenberg Koch was an early Danish immigrant, really came to Montana. I think it was pretty much, he wanted a better life. I think it was really a financial thing. He also became intrigued with plants. He was an instrumental person in starting Montana State University, actually in Bozeman. Maria Maurer was a biology teacher. She was hired by Sherm Priest starting in the 60s, I think, to look at wetlands. And I'm sure Steve's looked at lots of Marie Maurer collections. She collected wetlands all over the place. So they're all, I think Hope would have liked all these people. Hope Jahren. They're all people that had a lot, similar curiosities. But science was different, particularly back when we talk about these early people back then. I mean, Hope's book to me is such a celebration of science and such a, of curiosity. And this book is really about plant hunters. And it's about, even though I'm sure a lot of these people were thinking and maybe some of them writing on some little more complex questions, they also, a lot of what they were doing was collecting. Well, if you think about it, really we needed to know about different organisms, different species, to develop more complex scientific theory. So that was it was more of a fundamental change. So here we go. One of Hope's, my little quotes from the book. I think not only do the subjects of the book in general really see plants, but I'd like to think a lot of the people who are involved, all of us who are involved, also see plants. Okay, so I'm going to do a few quick, talk about some of the subjects of the book. David Lisle was enrolled in the Royal College of Surgeons in Edinburgh. He was born in Scotland. After he graduated, he went out on a whaling ship, which must have been very exciting. Then he joined the Royal Navy in 1839, and here was his compass, and I don't know if you can see there, it says HMS Terror. So, what did he do on the HMS Terror? He went with James Ross and circumnavigated the globe for 4 years and came back with a huge herbarium from that trip. Really, particularly in England, most of the botanical training was in medical school. Germany, has anybody read, what was the von Humboldt, Forces, Invention of Nature? Alexander von Humboldt. Okay, well, it talks about science, and that's a wonderful book, too. In England, really, science was all about medicine, and the only people studying plants, necessarily, they were looking for treatments for medicines. So, and then also sending people out these different areas. They're looking for, the plants are going to give you clues. Are we going to be able to grow something there? So that there was another reason. So he went with Ross 4 years on the Erebus and Terror and collected plants all over the place, and then presumably took care of the cruise there. This picture, there's a number of pictures I get to use here, but they're not in the book because we don't have, we don't have the authority to do them. And then he came back in 1952. He joined the expedition that went to look for Franklin in the Arctic. Well, this expedition, just looking for Franklin, had 5 ships, and 4 of them ended up being lost in pack ice, like all of Franklin's. Somehow, Lisle talked his way, I don't know, and again, this sounds like the tenacity of Hope Jahren, certainly. He brought back this huge herbarium. Well, if you have 5 ships and all the food and everything needed, and you end up with 1, and you bring back your herbarium specimens, this guy was committed, and I'm sure Hope would have been able to do the same the way she was able to, but why we're talking about Lisle is a big part of his career was he was appointed to the British contingent of the U.S. Boundary Commission. And they started out on Vancouver Island, and we had both a British contingent and a U.S. contingent were surveying the border. And Lisle got an appointment to the British contingent, and they went from the Pacific Ocean to the Continental Divide. And here was a monument, and this is right on the Continental Divide on the 49th parallel in Glacier Park. Now it's Glacier Park. I've been there. And he described many, he had new species, described many of them, including alpine larch. And I found this slide, it was in Jerry DeSanto's papers, and he had it labeled that it was to be used with this essay, which was pretty nice. Lyle collected over 67 specimens of 1,300 species. He was responsible for the health of the party as the doctor, from anywhere from 70 to 125 people. It was noted that he was definitely the best fisherman of the crew, which could be really important back then. Just one afternoon, he came back with 9 dozen trout in 4 hours. He had a dog that followed him along. It sounds like other things, it sounds like the mosquitoes were so bad. They talk about everybody losing tons, many pounds because the mosquitoes were so bad. It's like, oh, this was rough. So, some plants named after him: Penstemon lyalii, Phacelia lyalii, just a few, and of course there used to be many more. I used to always call this red stem saxifrage, but the scientific name's Saxifraga lyalii, so I'm sticking with that now. Red stem no longer. For the longest time, this was the only portrait I could find, and putting in the book, it's a little, and when we were doing the prepping for the centennial in 2010, I just was cruising the internet all the time and couldn't find anything, and all of a sudden, this popped up. It's like, oh my gosh. And it was attached to an article written by Andrew Lyle, who is a retired English barrister, interested in history, that there was some family history that maybe one of their family had gone to New Zealand, but they didn't really, still didn't know who he was, how he was connected to him, and then he started doing some research and said, oh my gosh, this guy was absolutely fascinating, and nobody's ever written anything about him. I mean, he had this amazing life. And so Andrew did a bunch of research and wrote an article for the Linnean, where that previous photo, this is David Lyle being inducted into the Linnean Society. So Andrew wrote an article for the Linnean, did some other things to have him commemorated. This is after 2010, and so I give him a call. And I said, as a matter of fact, some people have remembered him. This friend of mine wrote an essay about him, who's a botanist. Andrew wasn't a botanist, and we're going to publish it. So that was a really nice full circle sort of thing, and it's really expensive to send to mail books overseas, so I sent him kind of a batch of books in a big bag, the way you do it. And he then distributed them to various places, both in England and Switzerland and all that. Okay, here we are back in Helena now. Francis Duncan Kelsey was a congregational pastor. You call them pastors? I think so. And he and his wife came to Helena in 1885. A lot of more established churches had real hard times getting congregations up and going in the West. They tended to think we need a real brick and mortar church. Of course, there were a lot of preachers running around preaching here and there, and there was I didn't realize this until I started looking into it, quite the history of Presbyterians or the Methodists or whatever sending somebody out and then having to pour all this money into that congregation to keep it going, because of course the first thing you do is you put up a big fancy church. Well, Kelsey built a church, got it out of debt, built a parsonage. Here in Helena, he was very involved in what was considered, women's issues of the day. He really aligned himself with reform movements. Now we know he made a big deal about temperance. We don't know about suffrage. I just hope, I like to think that maybe he, he believed every minister should have a hobby, and he jumped into botany big time. And at Montana Conference of Congregational Churches, he gave a speech where he said, "Despondency may be overcome by going out into God's sunshine and upon its grand mountains." And he certainly took that to heart. In 1888 in Gates the Mountain, he discovered a unique little rosaceous plant, and this is one of the original collections in cities. It's one of 2 duplicates and a bunch of different notes, and it actually ended up, after other naming in other ways, it ended up being named its own species because it's so unique. So it's called a monotypic species because there's only one species, or monotypic genus, is there's only one genus in that species, and one species in that genus, excuse me, and it really is very unique. Now, if you want to see Kelsia in bloom, you're going to have to go out because it blooms very early. So here are some hardy folks sitting in this room that were on a mission to see Kelsia, and that's what they went through. And so plant folks are determined, like hope. You can see here the collections. It's very limited. It only grows in Montana. Steve, can you think of anything that I should note else about Kelsia? Where it's been collected. Those are all. What's that?
You did a good job on it.
Okay. Kelsey collected all over the place. Presumably, he had to mostly get back for Sunday sermons, but and I would imagine these somewhat follow railroad lines, not necessarily. He did collect the type specimens, so the plant that was used to name the species. Small shooting star. Kelsey's phlox is named after him. In 19, I don't know, sometime, he was in Helena for a bunch of years, and then he actually took a job teaching botany at Oberlin College, and so he really got into botany, and with his collections, he formed what was then probably the biggest plant collection in Ohio, but his main love continued to be being a minister, and he eventually left and went to Dayton, Ohio, started to build a church, and died shortly after. And actually, this window here is a Tiffany window that's in that church, and that's dedicated to Francis Kelsey. Now, I don't know, having a Tiffany window in a church in Ohio, it's still there. It's been there for well over 100 years. Or a genus named after you. I'm not sure. Everybody's their own. He's pretty well honored. Now, like I say, a lot of this book concentrates on the collections people made, but it's all in there in the same pot, and certainly all more complicated. Okay, I'm going to keep going. No, you know what? I'm going to skip over R.S. Williams. Got to get the book out of the library. It's a fascinating story, and he collected a lot. Okay, I'm going to jump ahead to see Leo Hitchcock. Leo Hitchcock was hired at the University of Montana to teach botany at U of M in 1930. He was a real visionary. As Hope Jahren early in her career moves to Georgia, and she noted that the American South is a plant's idea of Eden. Well, Montana in 1930 and the early 30s, particularly as things go, we had rough times in the teens also. Plants in Montana was certainly not a plant's idea of Eden. And C. Leo Hitchcock early on realized this was important, and some of his he did experimental seeding of what they called upside-down land or plowed lands, recognizing that we're losing all our topsoil, and some really neat things. He and students started noting in, let's see, what year? In 1935, when the first blooms were on Mount Sentinel, and there's some people still doing this. And this was the hottest and driest year on record. And species recorded blooming before the end of January. Now, I think it's happening again. included pussy toes, well, not a big deal. The Glacier, so this is in January. Sagebrush buttercup and yellow bells were blooming there. Eventually, he was lured away to the University of Washington. Well, they must have really wanted him because he wanted to go there, but he didn't want to go yet, and he just didn't bother to answer their letters, you know. So, and in the essay, there's some, well, it was mostly written by Art Krukberg, and they had these amazing summer field trips that he would take, spring break, and who could forget a typical day in the field for the party? He was up at 5 a.m. to the din of purposeful kitchen pot cymbals and a hearty breakfast of Hitchcock pancakes or biscuits. Then with hardly a breather, off into the field they would go, students trying hard to keep up with the master who, that's not what I wanted to do, who fired off, I just want to move this down, who fired, no, how can I move down? Here we go. I don't know. I'm trying to get my quote. Who fired off binomial salvos and sundry anecdotal items about the plants in the area. All the while, the students were making hay or putting up vast numbers of herbarium specimens. To finish the day in camp, some violent sport like football took over, with Hitchy sparking the play. He was always a huge fan of both the Grizzlies and the Huskies and everything. Well, one particular field trip that I'm sure is etched in a lot of people's, or was etched in a lot of people's memories, in something like 1932. And I can't get down to my notes here, I'm not sure. Anyway, Hitchy and Melvin Morris and another professor took 70 students on a field trip, I think 3,500 miles. Can you imagine? And they didn't have buses, so you know, these string of old jalopies. One car had 21 flat tires. I just can't imagine. And I had classes. Steve, did you have classes with Mel Morris? Okay, well, I'm old. And he was really old by the time I had an agristology class with Melvin Morris. I didn't realize that he was running around with C. Leo Hitchcock. Okay, so after he went to University of Washington, he did big-time monographs, very, very influential in taxonomy, but his big-time life's work was putting together the flora of the Pacific Northwest. And this was a 5-volume work, many different authors, but Hitchy was the main driving force. And the book has some fun little anecdotes about putting that together. So this was a big 5-volume thing, heavily illustrated, but then they also developed the field manual, and a couple generations of botanists in Montana. I mean, this was our Bible until Lesica's Manual of Montana Vascular Plants. And Hitchy, took the illustrations from the big one and then decided what he wanted, and apparently he just cut and pasted them onto the printed page. So he had to, and that was something that hadn't really been done, to have an illustrated field guide like that before. There actually, just in the last year, there's been a new edition of the, were you involved with that at all? No, Peter Lesica was, of just the field guide. So Hope, early in the book, says the scientific rights to naming a new species, a new mineral, a new atomic particle, a new compound, or a new galaxy are considered the highest honor and the grandest task to which any scientist may aspire. Well, if you Google around Hitchcock, oh my gosh, not only, of course, does he have lots and lots of species that were either named for him or by him, particularly by him. His name is at the end. We've had this big upheaval in taxonomy, so a lot of them, are no longer present. But he certainly would have been right up there. One of my favorite plants, and my husband was a forestry student, so some of the first native plants I learned in Montana were ones used for habitat typing, including Hitchcock's wood rush, and I just I just love this plant. It's actually, I believe, much more common in Montana than it is in Washington. And so I don't know. I see this. I have always, for the last 43 years, I've associated this with Hitchcock. When using the manual, I guess I never really thought about it. Well, I did some. And here's the flora of the Pacific Northwest, but it works really well for Montana. Well, what's the deal there? It's kind of like, okay, here's the Pacific Northwest, and then they have some species that are just also here. I didn't realize how much time Hitchcock spent in Montana. Even after he left and went to the University of Washington, he continued to come back year after year. And, he would hoard ration coupons for gas, to come back here, and there's lots of great stories about that. And here he is when he came back in 1975 and received an honorary doctorate at the University of Montana. And I don't know, just look at this guy. Really looks like somebody that could get people to collaborate, well together, bring the best out of people. Hope obviously did that in her labs. And I think that's about it. So, like I say, the book's out of print. Any questions? Yes?
Consider a reprint?
Yeah, we would consider it. We need it. That's a decision for the Montana Native Plant Society. We sold 400 copies. We may have kind of saturated the market. Also, our printer went bankrupt, so I don't know if I could be assured of the quality the second time around, but, we can't be assured. So yeah, it's under consideration, but it's not on the front. I would need other people's support, and I haven't seen that yet. Any thoughts about hope or any other kind of discussions? This was a huge undertaking by a lot of different people and a whole lot of fun. Most of the photographers are Plant Society members. Think of anything else? Yes?
You were talking about one of those early living plants?
No, herbariums and what most of these people were doing, or Hitchcock talking about making hay, was collecting, they probably did a little different back then. Now, you collect plants, maybe you stick them in a plastic bag and then press them, dry them so that they can be examined later. And so that's what, that's the way they got those back. Lewis kept losing stashes of his collections. They might bury them somewhere and then they get flooded, and so they didn't make it back. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Question, if I can. Is that Chelsea uniflora, is that the flowering moss?
Well, it's not a moss. It's a vascular plant, but it looks. I don't know. I suppose you might call it a flower. It looks like a moss in that it's very cespitose. Is that the right? I don't know if we can go back. Yeah. I've seen it after it was flowering on cliffs and thought, oh, that's an interesting moss, and you get up closer and like, no, that's not a moss. Yeah. Yes.
I think it only blooms like one day of the year, early spring,
April, and you've got to be hardy to go out and find it.
When my husband and I saw it, it was April. We went out on a little boat out in the Gates of the Mountains, and the guys at the Gates of the Mountains always know when it's blooming.
Oh, good.
And
That's
so
nice.
They can tell you, oh yeah, be sure to go in the canyon and see the Chelsea.
Oh,
And
good.
It's really beautiful, and it does look. I'm not a botanist, but when you see it, it's a clump and it sticks to the rocks, and it's real dark green, and it's like a moss, from a distance, and then when you get up close, you see it's not. And I think I'm not sure. I've seen it in. No, I'm gonna do the geezer thing. Trout Creek Canyon. As you're walking through Trout Creek Canyon, and you look on which is
Trout Creek over on the Clark Fork? No. Okay. Oh, okay. Again, I don't know whether one of those.
It's a
Yeah.
canyon with a hiking trail.
Yeah.
And I think I've seen it, but you can't get over there to see it because it's.
Right. Something that I was thinking about as I was reading Lab Girl, and the Flathead chapter of the Plant Society had a program last year with Tabitha Grace, who's actually a grizzly bear biologist, but she's gotten into bumblebees because bumblebees pollinate huckleberries, and huckleberries are really important for, and she gave a program and, whatever, but her enthusiasm and curiosity to me were such a celebration of science and inquiry. And I guess Hope's book is so much that, and realizing, and I like to think that this is, very different, but it's kind of a little bit of our contribution to that, and celebrating the people that have been looking and thinking and wondering. So, yes.
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the Montana Native Plant Society, what you do,
Well,
focus, is it about?
I should have some brochures, and I don't. We were formed, and Steve, you've been a member from day one, I'm sure. We have 700 individual members, not memberships, statewide. There's chapters. A lot of the activities that happen on a chapter level. So there's a Kelsey chapter. Here in Helena, we have a chapter in the Flathead, and we have programs. So we just hosted Jack Nisbet talking about his new book, Dreamer and the Doctor. Have field trips through the summer. You can find us on, just Google Montana Native Plant Society, and we have a website, and our webmaster is actually here in Helena. And we're concerned with conservation. We have a conservation committee, so that's kind of a low-key thing, but we write letters mainly to land management agencies about conservation issues. We do a lot of education. We have a great annual meeting once a year. Like I say, a lot of it is education. Right now, we're working with different agencies and groups. Montana doesn't have any plant conservation strategy. A lot of other states do. So if there's a rare plant, other than something that's federally listed or whatever, there's nowhere for land managers to, really get good information. Or so we provided some seed money, and we've got now, I think, a real good group of people looking at that and coming up with a way to develop a strategy that then will help landowners and land managers manage rare plants, particularly as the climate's changing. This becomes important. Yeah. So look. Yeah. I'm personally out of brochures, but I'm welcome, and I'm sure there'll be some other things. And Bob's not. I don't see Bob here. He's involved with the local chapter. Okay. So I'll be around. Oh, more questions. Okay.
I have one more question.
Yeah, good.
Because of what you just said, there's an important plant area designation.
Right, and that's something that the Native Plant Society started based on the Audubon Society. Have important bird areas. So we started doing those, and there's a fairly rigorous process. People nominate areas, and so based on a number of different characteristics, and you can go to our website and look at the places. Logan Pass has been designated an important plant area. What are some places in the Swan Valley?
An area in the gravelly range.
Right. So the idea there is, partly education of landowners and recognition of and of course we've had discussion about, and controversy within the organization about how those get nominated. But yeah. Anything else? Can you think of anything else to add about the Plant Society, Steve?
Well, the Kelsey chapter right here in Helena is struggling right now, and we would dearly love new members, any age, any aspiration. We're still able to have a herbarium night a few times about all we do right now. But
Yeah.
we used to be very active. And we'd like to resurrect it or
There.
revive it, if you would.
Do you have somewhere, just some piece of paper?
Where do you sign up?
Talk to Steve, or we'll figure it out. We'll get a, yeah, definitely, and get your email. Yeah, and that's, people are going home and watching TV, and they're not, anyway. I've been involved for over 30 years, and they just tend to be real. I mean, these people in the room here, look all like you're all great people, and so are the Plant Society people. They're just all really nice people. Annie Gard, even though, so we've got botanists like Steve. We've got a lot of just amateur botanists too. Okay.
And I'll say a plug. I'm not a botanist by training. I wish I'd spent more of my career doing that. But I've been to the annual meetings.
Oh, that's
and
right.
Hikes are phenomenal. And even if you're someone like me that likes to dabble, they're amazing. There's somebody that in the know on the hike that will stop at any plant that you ask him and tell a story about it. And it's fun. They're fascinating. I love it.
But we also need a critical core, and we're struggling in the Flathead also, with getting people to help with organizing. Anyway, okay. Thank you, Suzanne.